In the winter of 1260, the snow-covered plains of Europe were silent except for the sound of crows picking at the dead. Torn Mongol banners lay trampled beneath the boots of European peasants. A frozen Mongol commander lay face down in the mud, his helmet now serving as a peasant's cooking pot. This was the day the world's most feared empire met its end, not at the hands of kings, but of farmers. For decades, the Mongols had been gods of war, unstoppable riders who burned everything in their path. But when they rode into Europe for the last time, they faced something they had never seen before. They met people who had learned from their nightmares and turned those nightmares into weapons. The invincible had finally become the hunted. For almost half a century, the Mongol Empire had ruled like a storm, sweeping across continents. From the walls of China to the plains of Hungary, they left behind nothing but ashes. They broke kingdoms, erased cities, and turned rivers red with blood. No army could stand against them. They crushed the might of Persia, burned Kiev to the ground, and slaughtered Hungary so completely that survivors called their land the Field of Ghosts. Their arrows could pierce armor like paper, and their speed was unmatched. To face them was to die. Europe lived in terror of their name. Mothers warned their children at night, "Sleep, or the Mongols will come." Kings prayed to God not for victory, but for mercy. The Mongol horde seemed like demons on horseback, unstoppable, untouchable, unbreakable. Every castle wall, every knight's armor, every sword forged in Europe seemed useless against them. It was said that even the air grew quiet when their hoofbeats thundered across the earth. But every terror has an end. Every empire that calls itself eternal eventually finds the one enemy it cannot destroy. The Mongols believed they had conquered fear itself. They were wrong. Because deep in the heart of Europe, in lands they had burned 2 decades before, something ancient had awakened. The people they once slaughtered had not forgotten. They had learned. The peasants, the farmers, the survivors, they had watched, studied, and waited. When the Mongols came again, expecting easy prey, they didn't find fear. They found fury. They found fields turned to ash, wells filled with poison, and villagers who no longer ran. For the first time, the conquerors felt what it meant to be hunted. Europe, once broken and silent, had become a land of ghosts and traps, a place where the very soil rejected the invaders. The invincible horde that once made the world tremble had finally met an enemy that would not bow, would not beg, and would not break. The gods of war had become men, and men can bleed. For 20 years, Eastern Europe lived with the memory of fire. Villages burned, children taken, and whole cities erased. But fear, when it lasts long enough, changes shape. It hardens into hatred, and hatred learns. From Poland to Bohemia, the survivors of the first Mongol invasion began to study the enemy that had once destroyed them. They watched how the Mongols fought, how they moved, how they depended on their horses more than on any weapon. The rulers of these lands, men like Duke Bolesław of Poland and King Ottokar of Bohemia, understood one thing clearly. If you cannot outrun the Mongols, then you must make the land itself fight for you. Months before the next invasion, the order went out: burn everything. Entire villages were emptied, crops set on fire, and herds driven deep into the forests. Wells were filled with rotting carcasses. Salt and lime were poured into the earth so nothing could grow. Even the bones of the dead were dug up and hidden, so the Mongols could not grind them for food or calcium. Every field that once fed armies was now poisoned. Every road was lined with death. To an untrained eye, it looked like Europe had destroyed itself. But it was a trap, vast and patient. When Mongol scouts crossed the border in the winter of 1260, they found a nightmare instead of a kingdom. The land was silent. No smoke rose from chimneys. No animals wandered the fields. The rivers were black and foul with decay. The invaders thought the land had died, but in truth, it was waiting. The air stank of rot and ash. The snow fell on fields of poison. Even the wind carried the smell of death. For the first time, the Mongols faced an enemy that had vanished into the shadows, leaving only hunger and sickness behind. Then came the gift horses. Polish soldiers had left behind healthy-looking mares, tied in open fields as if abandoned. The Mongols took them eagerly, unaware that these horses carried glanders, a deadly disease that spread faster than arrows could fly. Within days, Mongol herds began to cough blood. Their throats swelled, their lungs filled with pus, and one by one they dropped in the snow. Still the army marched forward, not realizing they were walking into a graveyard of their own making. The Mongols had always believed the open steppe was their ally, but in Europe, the earth itself turned against them. The wells that once gave them water now killed their horses. The food they stole burned their stomachs. Even the firewood they gathered from the forests smoked with poison. Everything that had once given life was now death. By the second week, their pace slowed. By the third, their horses began to die by the hundreds. By the fourth, the great horde that once raced across continents could barely move. The Mongols had met armies before, but never this. Never an invisible war fought by soil, water, and sickness. The land that once trembled under their hooves had become their executioner. Europe had learned its lesson, and now the monsters who once devoured kingdoms were discovering what it felt like to be starved, hunted, and alone. The invaders had returned, but the earth no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the dead. The Mongols moved through the dead land in silence. Their horses limped, their supplies were gone, and their men were starving. But the worst part was not hunger. It was fear. They began to see shapes in the snow, figures that vanished when approached, whispers in the night, campfires that disappeared as soon as they drew near. The enemy was nowhere and everywhere. They didn't fight. They watched. They waited. Then they killed. At first it seemed like accidents. A few horses gone missing in the morning. A scout found with his throat cut, frozen eyes staring into the dark. Then it became a pattern. Mongol soldiers would wake to find their horses dead, every throat slit cleanly, the snow around them red and steaming. They would run into the woods searching for attackers, but there was no one, only footprints that ended in the middle of nowhere. They began to sleep in shifts, holding their bows even as they closed their eyes. But sleep was no escape. Some woke screaming that shadows had whispered in their ears. The Poles had learned the Mongols' own tactics and twisted them. They struck like ghosts, moving in small groups through the forest, killing only to vanish again. They poisoned food stores and water barrels. They left behind supplies just enough to tempt the desperate, grain mixed with hemlock, wine laced with wolfsbane. Those who ate lived long enough to crawl back to camp, vomiting blood, warning others too late. One Mongol captain wrote in his report, "We fight shadows that strike in the dark. My men refuse to eat, refuse to sleep. The land itself has gone mad. Paranoia spread faster than the disease. Every noise in the night was an enemy. Every rustle in the trees was death." The mighty Mongol horde, the army that had terrified continents, now feared empty air. They rode through the forests like hunted animals, their hands shaking, their eyes hollow. The warriors who once conquered empires were dying not by sword, but by terror. The land had turned them into prey. When they finally reached the Vistula River, they saw banners in the distance, Polish and Bohemian flags, fluttering in the snow. At last they thought a real battle, something they could win. They formed ranks, tightening their lines, ready for war. But what waited ahead wasn't a battle. It was a trap. The battlefield looked normal, wide, open, perfect for cavalry. Mongol generals smiled. They had crushed such armies 100 times before. They began their classic feigned retreat, pretending to run, ready to draw the knights into pursuit. But the knights did not follow. They stood still, shields raised, waiting. Confusion spread through the Mongol ranks. Then came the realization, too late. The ground beneath them wasn't solid. Hidden under the snow were deep trenches lined with sharpened stakes. Horses broke their legs by the dozens. Riders fell screaming into pits filled with mud and filth. Those who tried to turn back found the same death waiting behind them. Arrows rained from the tree lines. Polish crossbowmen appeared from hidden positions, aiming not for the men, but for their horses. One by one, the mounts collapsed, pinning their riders under their own weight. The sound of dying animals filled the air, screams, cracks, the thud of hooves in mud. The Mongols tried to regroup, but without horses, they were no longer warriors. They were just men, trapped in freezing blood and ice. Then the peasants came, thousands of them, armed not with swords, but with the tools of their fields, scythes, flails, and hammers. They moved through the snow like a tide, silent at first, then roaring with rage. The Mongols fought on foot, swinging wildly, slipping, screaming. It didn't matter. The peasants cut them down in waves, striking with a fury born from generations of fear. The invincible horde was gone, buried beneath the land they had once tried to conquer. Buried beneath the land they had once tried to conquer. By sunset, the field was quiet. The riders had become the hunted. The gods of war had become meat for crows. Europe had done the impossible. It had destroyed the army that the world believed could never die. The Mongol Empire had met its end, not by a greater army, but by farmers who had learned how to turn fear into vengeance. The eternal storm of the East had finally met the cold silence of Europe, and this time it did not rise again. By spring, the snow had melted, but the ground was still red. The air smelled of rot and smoke. Where Mongol camps once stood, there were only bones, blackened tents, and silence. The people of Europe came out from the forests, slowly at first, then in waves. They walked through the ruins of what had been the greatest army in the world, and they did not tremble. They laughed. The terror that had haunted them for a generation was gone. The invincible had fallen. Across Poland and Bohemia, peasants piled Mongol skulls into pyramids by the roadsides, each one a marker of victory. Some villages built crosses from Mongol bones and hung them in churches. Others turned skulls into drinking cups, laughing as they filled them with wine. For decades, the Mongols had called themselves wolves among sheep. Now those same wolves were being eaten by the sheep. The world had turned upside down. The knights of Europe, who once hid behind castle walls, now rode through the fields displaying Mongol banners as trophies. The banners that once made kings surrender now burned in the public squares, their golden eagles and black suns curling into ash. In Vienna, merchants sold pieces of Mongol armor as souvenirs. In Krakow, a blacksmith melted Mongol swords into plowshares, saying, "Let their steel feed the earth they tried to burn." But the worst fate was not death, it was capture. Thousands of surviving Mongols were rounded up by peasants and sold like cattle. Venetian traders, ever hungry for profit, bought them for almost nothing. The warriors who had once enslaved nations were now bound in chains, their faces hollow, their pride gone. They were sold in the markets of Constantinople and Cairo, to the same civilizations their fathers had once tried to destroy. Some became gladiators. Others were forced to work as servants for the people they once called inferior. The wolves of the steppe were now dogs on leashes. The Mongol children were taken too. The boys were castrated and sold as eunuchs, their names erased, their language beaten out of them. The girls were sent to brothels and noble houses, sold to men who wanted to claim the daughters of the conquerors. The empire that once prided itself on its cruelty now suffered it. Every punishment they had given to others returned 100-fold. The gods of war had been dragged into the mud. In the cities of Europe, people began to tell stories. They spoke of how the Mongols were not demons, only men who bled, starved, and begged for mercy. The myth of invincibility shattered. The name that once froze blood in every kingdom now brought laughter. Children played games called Hunt the Tartar, chasing each other with wooden sticks and shouting in joy. Farmers wore necklaces made from Mongol finger bones as protection charms, and priests called it divine justice. Everywhere, the same truth spread. The terror was over. The world had learned that the Mongols could be beaten, humiliated, and destroyed. Their empire, once the size of the sky, now seemed as small as a broken banner in the dirt. The wolves who had ruled the earth were now meat for farmers. The eternal empire was finished, not by kings or crusades, but by the hands of those who had once cowered before it. The myth was dead. The gods of war had fallen, and Europe was no longer afraid. The story of the Mongols did not end with their deaths on frozen fields. It lived on as a warning, a shadow stretching across history. Europe, once a land of frightened villages and burning cities, had changed forever. The people who had spent decades praying for mercy had learned something new. They had learned the art of total war. The Mongols had shown them what terror could do, and Europe had taken notes. No longer would kings and peasants fight by old rules or chivalric codes. The lessons of the steppe had been written in blood. Move fast, strike first, leave nothing behind. The Mongols had conquered through speed, fear, and destruction. Now those same weapons belonged to Europe. The students had become the masters. In time, those lessons would echo in crusades, in conquests, and in empires that stretched across oceans. Every burning city in the centuries to come carried a trace of what the Mongols had once taught the world. But for the Mongols themselves, there was no second act. Their messengers returned home broken and silent, their stories filled with nightmares of poisoned earth and hunters who fought like ghosts. In the camps of the Golden Horde, old warriors refused to believe what they heard. How could peasants defeat the riders of the eternal sky? Yet the proof came walking into their tents, men without noses, without ears, without fingers, whispering of Europe, the land of death. One survivor, a young scout named Kutu, became a legend among his own people. He had seen the horrors of Poland and lived to tell them. Every night, he warned the new warriors who dreamed of conquest. Do not ride west, he told them. Do not follow the road to the land of bells. There the earth drinks blood and the dead do not sleep. The farmers wear our bones as charms. The wells are poison and the forests whisper our names. His words were repeated from one camp to another until even the most fearless Mongol refused to cross. Into Europe again, it was the final echo of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Mongols had believed they were untouchable, chosen by the sky to rule all beneath it. But in teaching others how to destroy, they had written their own ending. They taught Europe how to be monsters, and Europe never forgot. The same tactics that once burned Asia would one day burn continents in return. In time, the Mongol Empire shattered into fragments. China broke free. Persia rebelled. The Golden Horde faded into dust. But the lesson they left behind never disappeared. Power built on fear will always meet something worse. The conquerors had become a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered around fires for centuries to come. And in the end, the warning of that lone survivor proved true. There was no glory left in conquest. The eternal sky had fallen. The riders of the storm had vanished. And somewhere deep in the frozen soil of Europe, the bones of the invincible still whispered their secret, that those who teach the world how to be monsters will one day be devoured by their own creation. The wind over Eastern Europe still carries their memory. It moves through empty fields where bones lie buried beneath centuries of soil, through forests that once echoed with hooves and screams, and through villages built on the ashes of war. The Mongols once believed they were chosen by the heavens, destined to rule all beneath the eternal sky. For a time, it seemed true. No army could stop them, no wall could hold them. But even the greatest storms run out of wind, and even the eternal sky must one day fall. When the Mongols came, they brought fire and fear. When they left behind something even greater, a lesson written in blood. Power built on terror cannot last. The people they thought weak learned to fight without rules, without mercy, without fear. The farmers, the priests, the hunters, the widows, they became soldiers in spirit long before they ever picked up a weapon. In the end, it wasn't kings or knights who destroyed the Mongols. It was the people who had nothing left to lose. Europe would never be the same again. The peasants who once bowed to lords now stood taller. The kings who once hid behind castle walls now rode with the courage of men who had seen the end of terror. And far to the east, the Mongol Empire began to crumble under its own weight. One by one, the great Khanates fell apart, leaving only silence where thunder once ruled. The invincible had become dust. History remembers the Mongols as conquerors, but it also remembers their fall. Their defeat was not just a battle lost, it was the death of a myth. For the first time, the world saw that even the most feared empire could break. The name that once made nations tremble now belonged to ghost stories told around winter fires. The Mongols had shown the world how to destroy, But Europe had shown them something stronger, how to endure. And so, the lesson of the invincible was written in the snow and stone of Europe's soil. Empires rise, empires fall, but arrogance always ends the same way, with silence. The Mongols called their empire the eternal sky, but even the sky ends at the edge of a farmer's scythe. Ends at the edge of a farmer's scythe.